The rest of the country tends to think of California as some sort of like left wing, bastion or hellhole, depending on how your politics lie. But at best, it's a liberal state. And I mean that in the traditional sense. There's tons of conservatives here, first of all. More people in California voted for Donald Trump than like Wyoming, Montana, West Virginia, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, all combined. All right. Those are low population states. California has the highest population of any state in the country. 1 out of every 8 Americans lives in California. Okay. It's not even close with the rest of these states. And as such, there's tons of conservatives here. Millions, millions and millions and millions. I think Donald Trump got somewhere near like 7 million votes in California in 2024. Yeah, like I said, you could add up like 9 Republican states and the votes that were cast for Donald Trump, and you barely get to the amount of people who voted for Donald Trump in California. But really, it's just a very corporate and commercial and capitalist state. We just happen to have a slightly more progressive tax structure and some socially progressive views on things, but not even really totally the case with that either. I won't get into that right now, but it's just a really big misperception. And I think that there's a lot of criticism that can be lobbed from the left towards California, and a lot of criticism that largely gets focused on from the right of California. And I think it's a perfect example of how just because Republicans have criticism of something doesn't mean that we have to defend it on the left, right? We can be critical of something for different reasons than Republicans are critical of something. We can all be critical of the same thing for different reasons. And I think we saw this with Joe Biden, right? Like Republicans would say things about Joe Biden. Republicans were saying that he was too old. And for some reason, Democrats by default were defending him. And people on the left, a lot of people on the left at least, went along with that. No reason to do that. Just because Republicans are saying something doesn't mean that it's inherently wrong. Now, they were taking it to a super far degree, right? Like, they were essentially saying the guy was in a fucking coma the whole time he was in the White House. And I think that was kind of demonstrably not true. But that doesn't mean that he was fit to be in office. We've all across the political spectrum lost hold of nuance in this country, and it's a big fucking problem. California is facing a budget shortfall, and it's really interesting because just like a month ago, Gavin Newsom was all over the news talking about how California had become the world's 4th largest economy. And if you haven't heard anything about that, world's 4th largest economy. So that's among nations: United States, China, Germany, California, Japan. It's a huge economy. It's insane. Its GDP is like twice the size of Texas's GDP or New York's GDP, which are like the next 2 states after California in terms of state GDPs. It's huge. It's a huge state. And a lot of that has to do with the population and the size of the state. But there's just a ton of industries here, tons of very profitable industries too, between Hollywood, real estate, agriculture, all these kinds of places, or all these kinds of industries that generate a ton of money. But yeah, California is an extremely wealthy state. So Gavin Newsom was all over the news talking about how it's the 4th largest economy in the world. Cut to a month later, and now there's all this talk about this I think it's $15 billion budget shortfall, and what has to be done in order to recover from that budget shortfall. And what sort of solutions is Gavin Newsom offering? Well, he wants to implement an asset test for Medi-Cal, which is like our Medicaid here in California. Essentially, if you have $2,000 or more, you get booted off of Medi-Cal. Now, that's insane. Just on its, no matter where you are in the country, that's insane. If you're a senior and you have more than $2,000 in assets, you don't qualify anymore. If you're disabled and you have more than $2,000 in assets, you don't qualify anymore. $2,000. What does that get you anymore? That's a number that was picked for this asset test back in 1989. It's insane. But it's even more insane here in California, where you can't really get rent for less than $2,000. So if you have a month's rent in your checking account, you have $2,000 worth of assets probably. And it's wild. It's wild. It's a wild, terrible, terrible idea. And he also said something recently, like California has a spending problem. I don't really accept that, but like, sir, you're the governor and you've been the governor. And it's crazy to me how much he wants to start talking about this now as he's getting ready to leave office. And the reason why he's doing it is because he wants to be president. Gavin Newsom will never be the president of the United States, ever, ever, ever. And I don't know who's told him that he has a chance of being the president, but he's wrong. But whoever did it needs to, nice troll, but you need to tell the guy that it's never going to happen. But it's really emblematic of the Democratic Party in general, right? Because they do this all the time. Gavin Newsom could get appointed to the Trump administration he could go so right wing that he ends up in the Trump administration, and Republicans would still not like him. Republicans would not vote for him. Republicans will still say he's a socialist, he's a commie, California, blah blah blah, all those things. You will never convince those people to vote for Gavin Newsom, no matter what. But he's still going to chase those votes. Those are the voters that he's concerned with chasing, not the voters on the left, not the voters that the Democratic Party consistently ignores. He's going to try to play the same book and the same strategy that Kamala Harris played and failed, that Hillary Clinton played and failed, that Joe Biden only succeeded with because of COVID, and it's going to fail. It'll fail hopefully in the primaries because people on the left are a little bit more awake to Gavin Newsom, I think, than people more in the center or liberals in general. But yeah, he's going to chase those votes, and no matter what will fail. He will not get those people to vote for him. And he doesn't have to worry about getting people in California to vote for him again, because California is going to go for Democrats no matter what. And as far as the Electoral College is concerned, there's no benefit to Republicans for trying to run for the state at the presidential level, which is part of the problem with the Electoral College. It disenfranchises both Republicans and Democrats. People on the left and the right are fucked over by the Electoral College. Because those 6 million some odd people who voted for Donald Trump in California, their votes didn't mean anything. They didn't get anything out of that, and if we were just on a popular vote system, these politicians would have to actually run in these states that are blue states or red states. They would actually have to go there and campaign because every vote would count. It really does mirror the issues with the Democratic Party. And Gavin Newsom, like I said, will never be president, but there's a lot of reasons why he shouldn't be the nominee, and I don't think he will be the nominee. But you can find reasons on the left and the right to not vote for that guy. And I think it really comes down to that nuance that we're lacking in our political discourse that we really need to focus on trying to find again. Yeah, California has a very long and storied history of exporting terrible Republicans to the rest of the country. Obviously, Reagan was our governor, but also Nixon. Not great. And I think Gavin Newsom is the latest iteration of us sending our worst Republicans out into the world. And I know that a lot of MAGA folks would think that I'm crazy for calling Gavin Newsom a Republican, but I'll say the same thing to them that I say to their dad every night, which is, if I want your opinion, I'll tap you on the back of the head. Also, I want light teeth, not no teeth, and not chewing on it. There's a happy medium. Anyway, but Gavin Newsom, like you pointed out with his wives or partners, obviously his current wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, she was a Republican until they got married, and she was born and raised in San Francisco, and this is back when he was the mayor of San Francisco, and then they got married, and she switched to independent. She didn't switch to Democrat; she switched to independent. And San Francisco itself has kind of a long history with Republican politics. It's only really been in the last. The tracking of San Francisco leaving the Republican Party, it runs along with the Republican Party becoming so socially conservative. It's kind of similar to how the Democrats have lost a lot of working class voters as they've become such a party of people with higher education degrees. As the Republican Party has tacked more toward social conservatism, they've lost places like San Francisco. But like, for instance, Harvey Milk, the very famous gay San Francisco council member and gay activist who was assassinated, he was a Republican. And there is a longer history of the Republican Party prior to it really holding on to this social conservatism and Christian nationalism, where a lot of people from big cities and a lot of people from demographic groups that you would consider to be now traditionally in the Democratic camp were Republican. But Gavin Newsom's, wife, current wife, was a Republican, and like I said, and now she's an independent. And then obviously, he was with Kimberly Guilfoyle, who until just last year was with Donald Trump Jr. You probably remember her from the RNC in 2020.
A proud supporter of President Donald J. Trump.
Woof. Fucking insane person. But yeah, I mean, like, Gavin Newsom's politics, it tracks this kind of branch of like more liberal republicanism that has largely died out. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger was our governor, and he was a Republican, and I think he's a good example of this. It's kind of like more socially progressive, far more moderate, just like pro-business, pro-markets, market solutions to problems, government intervening and government involvement, but on the side of business and on the side of markets. I think Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland, is another example of this kind of strain. I think he's a little further to the right of Gavin Newsom or of Arnold Schwarzenegger, but not by much. It's really been Donald Trump that has like tanked that side of the Republican Party. But yeah, Gavin Newsom, I mean, some of the examples, like this asset test thing really drives me nuts because, as I mentioned in the video before, and I'll just very briefly, the asset test is essentially if you have $2,000 in assets, if it was to be implemented, you would no longer qualify for Medi-Cal, which is the California Medicaid and Medicare kind of program. The idea behind that is so, frankly, conservative and so markets based and so anti-worker, anti-poor, anti-working class. It comes right out of the Republican playbook. I mean, the amount of money put aside, just this, like, think about it this way, like, if California were this like super left-wing state like everyone seems to think it is, and if Gavin Newsom was this super left-wing governor like everyone seems to think he is, the solution to this budget shortfall would be on the revenue side. It would be closing tax loopholes. It would be increasing taxes on not just incomes of high earners, but we're talking about things like wealth taxes and asset taxes on people who have the most. And California has a very high concentration of people who have the most. But instead, we're focusing on the assets of the poor. I mean, that's insane. And when you think about like benefits like Medicaid and food stamps, stuff like that, it always comes to this idea of like what it is that you have. So if you've managed to save, but your income is low, the state's concerned about what you've saved. And so the idea, if you like play this out, is like that you should burn through all of your savings before you qualify for Medicaid. Like, make that make sense. And it ends up, what it ends up doing is you spend money on things down the road as a state, right? So if somebody burns through all their savings, just, and then qualifies for Medi-Cal, what happens when they, there's a fucking fire or an earthquake or just any other normal like life emergency, and they end up homeless or they end up, needing other government benefits? You end up spending more money on these people than you have to if you had just given them the support when they needed it, where they needed it. Income, if you're going to put limits on people's access to benefits, Income is where you do it, not assets. Assets, it's just so insane. Like someone could work their whole lives, be really good at saving money, and then what, you want them just to burn through all of that before they qualify for healthcare? I mean, think about the cost of healthcare in this country too. I mean, you just burn through your entire life savings in a year or two, depending on what's going on with your health. And then you'll ultimately still qualify for Medi-Cal. Like, and all you've done is bleed somebody of their savings. And focusing on that to close this budget shortfall, rather than focusing, like I said, on where all the money is. You know, as I mentioned in the last video, you know, California being the 4th largest economy in the world, that means that there is a ton of fucking wealth and a ton of money in this country, or in this state. And that's where you should be looking to close this budget gap. Because people, you know, people who have that much wealth, into billions and billions of dollars, they didn't get that with nothing. It's not like they just, you know, it's this bootstraps idea, right? Where we have to like be really careful about what we do to those people. And we can't take their money because, you know, they've worked hard and earned this. So of the people who've managed to save up, what, like $15,000 for their retirement, it's almost nothing, right? But you've managed to scrimp and save and put aside a little tiny nest egg of $15,000. Gavin Newsom says you don't get health insurance until that $15,000 is gone. Wild, absolutely fucking wild that that's the focus. And it's emblematic of the Democratic Party in general, but Gavin Newsom is 100% filled with these fucking Republican ideas. I mean, you hear him talk about the homeless, it's the same thing. I mean, his focus has been on people who don't have housing, as opposed to the cost of housing, people who are involved in these housing monopolies, all these investment firms that are buying up the housing stock. Those are the places where you go and focus on trying to make housing more affordable, and then you can reduce homelessness. And under Gavin Newsom, I mean, homelessness is fucking ballooned in the in California, more than doubled. And he's out there, you know, villainizing people who don't have housing, as opposed to villainizing the people who are responsible for that. Because this is the other thing, which is that and numbers vary depending on, you know, where the surveying is done. But I'll just say the vast majority, and I mean by a huge percentage, like 70, 80% of people who are homeless in California have had a home in California in the last 5 years. So they have been made homeless. And the overriding reason for that they give when they're asked in these surveys is that the cost of housing got to be too much and they ended up homeless. That's your problem. That's where the homelessness comes from. It's not even really the like the fentanyl epidemic or any of these kinds of things that get scapegoated. It's the cost of housing. You need to reduce the cost of housing. It needs to be cheaper to live in California than it is. And some other folks have talked about this, and I've talked about this too, which is that California should be the mascot for the Democratic Party. It should be something that they can point to constantly and be like, look how successful we are, look how great we are, look what our policies do to help people, to help working people, to help the majority of people. But the majority of people, working people, cannot afford to live in California. And that is a massive incrimination of the Democratic Party, no matter how you slice it, because Democrats control every part of the government in this state. And if they want to have a party that is broadly appeals to the working class again, California is the place to do it. This is the place that they have the means, that they have the power, that they have the resources, frankly, because you can do so much stuff in California and not break the budget, but you have to have a guiding progressive, at very least, progressive approach. And Democrats don't have a vision. It's just whoever is giving them the most money that week, that's whose interests they'll be out there defending. And Gavin Newsom is, in a lot of ways should be the Democratic nominee because he is so perfect. He's such a perfect example of a Democrat these days. But philosophically, fits just fine into the Republican Party too. It really, or the Republican Party of like 10 years ago.
And it's really interesting. It really shows you how much the parties really have no differences between them until very recently. And with Democrats chasing Republican voters, they still don't have that much of a difference between them. I would say there's a gap between Democrats and Republicans more than there has been in a very long time in terms of policy. But it's still not that much. And Democrats are, man, fucking putting on their running shoes and galloping to the right to try to get to try to catch up to the Republicans in this rightward shift of our politics. It's so frustrating. I fucking hate the Democratic Party, and I fucking hate Gavin Newsom. God, fuck that guy.